my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm going to do a weekly review, weekly reads. I think I'm going to change it to weekly review just so that searching comes up better. I'll probably put the most sort of exciting titles that I have for review of the week as well as weekly review, and then that way if people search those things, it'll pop up. We'll see. Much like previous week, I counted the books correctly, but then didn't talk about the first book in the order. So I guess in tradition now, I'm going to talk about a book that I read last week that I didn't talk about, and then resume talking about the books that I actually read this week. So I read on audio, but did not talk about Call Me Indian, From the Trauma of Residential School to Becoming the NHL's First Treaty Indigenous player by Fred Sasakamoose, and narrated by Wilton Littlechild because, as you may or may not know, the author passed away last year of COVID-related complications. So this is, it does what it says it does on the tin. It's 4 stars. It's really a shame, more than a shame. It's a travesty that the residential schools, biographies and memoirs that you read all have very similar tales as to what was happening. He was raped as a child by other boys and not people in power there, but they knew what was happening and allowed it to happen anyway. He was taken away from his family. He slowly started to forget Cree, and it altered his life forever. And he had a very weird, well, not weird, but he had a strange dissonance between his school years, which become at once granular and then go to a rapid pace, like it fast forwards essentially to when he's done. And it's strange to put the kids in that position because he found himself never discussing his situation until only a few years before he died, because he wanted his family members, his mother and his father particularly, to not worry about him in school. So he never actually disclosed to them what was happening. And so they kind of believe that the party line, like the Canadian line about like him needing to be naturalized and getting assimilated in a job and all this stuff, where at the same time he was having like a living hell essentially, except for when he was on the ice, being taught by a very particular priest who was the person who assembled the team. And if you've read any other like Indian Horse or other memoirs about the hockey players that emerged from that, then you'd know the story. And in fact, I guess he said a lot of people conflate his story with Indian Horse, with Wagamese. But yeah, that just sort of shows the parallels there, where both went through a horrific experience, both emerged learning a new skill with hockey and using that as like a lifeline for surviving that place, basically. But the difference is this is the first person who got inducted to the NHL in Chicago, I believe. And it's mostly about his personal life, which I like quite a bit. I don't care at all about hockey, despite being Canadian. It's fairly straightforward. It isn't like... It's written in the style that you would expect from the memoir. It serves its purpose. The narration was quite good, and it's good to hear it narrated so that everything is pronounced correctly as well, because he peppers a lot of Cree language throughout it. I believe it's Cree, I'm fairly certain. And he's very forthcoming about things in latter life, which I wasn't aware of. He correctly assumes that a lot of people won't know him beyond what happened to him in the NHL, where he played a short amount of time, like 10 days or something, 10 games, something like that, before choosing to focus on family and his new wife and all that kind of stuff and not deal with the racism. And he talks about how people were disappointed in him because he was supposed to pioneer the way, but there's so much pressure because he's facing all this racism, and then all these people are like, you're supposed to be the one that breaks ground and makes everything equal for us and stuff like that. It's very like difficult, and I can't even imagine what it would be like to go through that stuff and feel like you have to deal with white space and racism to pioneer and naturalize a space and normalize a space rather, and have people be disappointed in you because you didn't even do, you know, more and what they expected of you. He then went on to be a leader. There was a wild story about his son ostensibly murdering somebody and taking his own life, which I wasn't aware of as well. So there's a lot of trigger warnings in this book, I would say. But yeah, I gave it 4 stars. It was more than I expected, and I was glad that I had consumed it. All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days, the true story of an American woman who I think most people actually are aware of, but it assumes that you aren't, who led a resistance or was part of the resistance in Nazi Germany. I can't talk about this book, even though I have a rating of it. I read it the day before I was assigned it for the BookTube prize. So you could just, I guess, go read that review, but otherwise I can't talk about it. I gave up on Beasts of a Little Land by Juhea Kim. This I have a video up on, but it felt like very paint by numbers historical fiction. It had a rape in it for a plot device reason that is a very big pet peeve of mine, and it just wasn't going someplace that I thought was interesting, except that it had an interesting premise and I was trying to engage with it. So I DNF'd it at 20%, left my thoughts, and then the author decided to retaliate and rate all of my self-published cyberpunk books, or 3 of them anyway, 1 star in retaliation. I have a video about that you can check out. As far as the book goes, though, I obviously don't recommend it, but I think people that are fans of historical fiction that really want to know about the Korean or the Japanese occupation of Korea in that time and have fantastical elements that do jibe with stylistically with the prose we're doing, and don't mind the sort of sophomoric components of what I would call the craft to be, would still enjoy it. And indeed it has like a 4.04 or something like that, and 2,000 ratings already with a month being out. So most people will like it, and you might like it as well. I then read Generations by Lucille Clifton, which is a NYRB book that I tabbed a little bit, just particular sentences that resonated with me. This is very short. It's like 76 pages or something. Took me like an hour or something to consume. It's very poetic, lyrical. It actually reminded me a lot of Hemingway at his best, but with, what is it called? AAVE, African American vernacular, peppered within it. So it feels like kind of reclaiming space, or making space, I guess, in contemporary stylists, or modern contemporary stylism for a Black author and voice. It goes, it's what it says on it is on the tin. It's very like focused and about particularly her family, and sort of just what it means for her to have been educated, what emancipation led to directly for her. It sort of is about coming of age, though so focused I hesitate to classify it as such. I give it 4 stars. I thought it was excellent. It does retread ground because it is doing a non-linear sort of set of essays, maybe you could say. And so there is retreading ground. Some of it is for the musicality of the prose and the lyricism happening, but Sometimes it does get slightly annoying, even though I can see why this is as heralded as it is, and it's certainly deserved to be reissued in the way that it has, so that's great. Then I read Several People Are Typing, and I did this on audio, which I thought could have been bad, but was actually fine. I gave it 3 stars. It's funny, meaning that I don't really go for the kind of comedy that it was going for. It's about a guy who gets stuck inside a computer, inside Slack. Some unsettling components that is trying to have some discussion around how we use computers, and I thought it was just fine. Like, the points that it made weren't particularly well made, I thought, and it clipped along nicely. There's different voices in the narration for every different person speaking. This was a very well done audiobook that could have gone sideways, and it was just fine. Next, I read Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. I've got this for like a couple weeks now. It was on Book Outlet for cheap, and a lot of people rave about it. I thought it was going to be, honestly, I thought it was going to be something to do with Greek mythology, but it's not. It's about a preacher who knows he is going to be dying soon. He's quite old, and he's leaving notes or letters, some conveyance anyway, to his son, and just sort of trying to explain who he is, what he thinks, the most important components about him in like epistolary type ways. It's really moving at times and very surprising in its characterization of faith, I thought anyway. Rather than sort of blind faith and blind guidance and trusting to know the correct things to say to people, it's just much more humane and nuanced and more of like a daily struggle narrative where he is constantly embattled, I guess, to confront these narratives about God and his faith and how people act in hypocritical ways in comparison to them and parallel to it, and what that says about him, the times that he's failed, the times that he has succeeded, how he feels he can't relate to his son, and the courtship of he and his wife at the time. It's quick. I thought the prose were fantastic, and definitely a book that I would even revisit in the future. I'll probably continue with this series. I don't know where it would go from here with the formatting. Like, is it just a universe that's been created with different characters? I have no idea. But I will definitely read more of her because I do have housekeeping as well. Then I consumed The Black Church. This is our story. This is our song by Henry Louis Gates Jr. or Louis Gates Jr. I did not rate this because it is part of my assignment for the BookTube Prize nonfiction category that I got, so I can't say anything about it. However, the note that I made in Goodreads I'll make here too. It is Black History Month. I don't want to dissuade or say nothing about a book during Black History Month that is about a component that I knew nothing about it. So I would say that whatever its strengths and weaknesses, it is speaking about a subject I knew very little of, and probably other people don't either. After that, I consumed Aftershocks by Nadia Owusu, and this was on audio, and the narration was quite good, I found. I believe it's from the actual narrator, as is, by the way, Black Church is narrated by the author, who is also in the narrator in the PBS documentary that accompanies it, I believe. And you can tell it's kind of like formatted like that. Okay, I'm back. So my neighbor started, I don't know, using a leaf blower or something like that. It's finally warm out. It's like 10 degrees here instead of minus 22. So I think he's getting yard work done or something like that. But it was so loud that I had to stop and then continue later. I was talking about Aftershocks by Owusu. This was a very personal memoir in terms of like being very vulnerable and open, and really kind of laying out there how it felt to her to be of two identities. They flee a country when she was quite young. She came to America, and her parents have like a similar like schismatic relationship. They were kind of like ripped apart from each other for different ways, in ways that she didn't understand as a child, similarly to her leaving. There's obviously comparisons to earthquakes and the aftershocks of an earthquake, and similarly very like epicenter type events occur in her life and the aftershocks of which she goes into. It I wouldn't say meanders, but the focus shifts quite often with each chapter. There's a very big, maybe vogue thing, I guess, right now to be non-linear and skip around and try to just let the reader make free associations between all of these things. But it necessarily makes things feel less thematically cogent to me when that is done, because it's so subjective. It feels like it is less attributed to storycraft for me to associate what I think this book is about and the themes that I see in it to what the author is doing, and not me in my motivated thinking projecting those things onto the text. So it's very hard for me to rate things like that, I think. And so it's very interesting that this is very much becoming like a done thing. It seems like it's not a trend that's going away, and I'm kind of mixed on it. But I gave this book 4 stars. It exceeded my expectations. At points, it's definitely a 5-star read, but sometimes it is simply going into, again, with these non-linear things, retreading ground and coming at things that we know in seemingly separate, different ways, like different points in her life, examining the same event, theoretically could be good, but generally, because it is left to subjectivity, I end up thinking the exact same things about the event multiple times over, basically. So it's an interesting stylistic choice that I think is engaging, but again, mixed. Next, I read Exciting Times by Naui's Dolan. I'm almost positive that's incorrect, but last name should be correct, Dolan, and she is Irish, so I'm sure that it is not how I think it is pronounced. This has the same narrator as the Sally Rooney audiobooks, which is fantastic. The story is always kind of compared to a Rooney-esque thing. It's about a woman. She leaves to Hong Kong and she gets kind of embroiled in this love triangle-esque type situation. Similar things to Rooney in terms of wanting to be exploring interactions between peoples of a certain age, with class involved. But I think the added bonus of this is we have the queer experience added into the mix that really changes things for me. Also, the author has less of a like perspicacity, I guess, about every specific interaction that is taking place. I find Rooney to be very granular about very hyper-specific interactions, which will generally be the entire chapter, and sort of be like the set pieces of those chapters, whereas this has a more contemporary layout in terms of the structure, but it goes over moments just like every other contemporary book, I would say. But her female character, from which we're experiencing everything, has a really fantastic personality that bleeds through, and so it becomes like a darkly funny, in which I actually laughed out loud. situation where she highlights the inadequacies of male-female interactions, in which men so often think that they're coming off as like dominating, interesting people that everybody would want to know and to sleep with and stuff, but clearly they're sort of just an eye roll emoji, basically. It's very clever in that way. It's very engaging. The pace itself falters somewhat because one of the characters leaves for a while, and it feels like the narrative tension kind of leaves with him as well. But yeah, so it feels kind of like it's spinning its wheels at that point, but it does grip. And when especially the queer themes, queer characters enter and become predominant, it was positively, like an electrifying read, I thought. Like, it really gave it more energy and more substance right away. And it went from like a 3-star read to a 4-star read, at times a 5-star read. So I'll definitely read more from this author in the future. The next book is Lisa Taddio's Animal, which is right there. This was a fantastic book. I gave it 4 stars. Again, something that reaches 5 stars at points, but didn't quite make it. It is about a woman who essentially becomes more and more unhinged as male-dominating violence saturates her life. A former lover of hers walks into a dinner with her and this man who she may or may not be engaged with in terms of like romance and sexual relationship, etc., and shoots himself. To respond to that, she essentially flees every aspect of her life and kind of regresses into her trauma. It's an instinctual thing, an animalistic thing maybe, as she forges new relationships and continually struggles and portrays her gender dynamics with typically men. She is an older woman, 37, 38 years old, and thinks of herself as even older, like over the hill. So it's kind of like a reverse actress going to LA when she is young to discover herself, but a regression of trauma coupled with that kind of narrative at an older stage of life, basically. I thought the prose were absolutely phenomenal. It is characterized by some people as misandrous, and I didn't think it was at all, especially from her perspective and her lens and the things that she goes through and how that lens develops. The entire story is literally about how she has developed her gender dynamics and her thinking towards men, and how it's colored by trauma, essentially, at many points in her life. She kind of, a line that stuck with me said that she has only ever remembered being 10, being 30, and now 37. Like the memory, the gaps that are there, the things that she recalls, her emotional, physical maturity, all of those things are milestoned by specific events in her life. The ending was surprising. It was completely captivating, very honest. I thought it was just a phenomenal entry to the unhinged women genre that I love. Next, I read The Extraordinary Adventures of Adele Blanc-Sac, and this is by Jacques Tardy, which is, sorry for my butchering of pronunciation, by the way, but this is French, and it was recently translated. I say recently, but it was like 8 years ago. The first 2 volumes, which have 2 volumes in each, so 4 total, this one has 2, were translated and then abandoned, I guess. Maybe they didn't sell too well, although this stock seems to have completely sold through. It was hard to get a copy of it. I had to get one used. And then maybe the second one didn't do so well and then they abandoned it. I don't know. Either way, it's in the 70s. It's completely off the wall. some of it doesn't really make sense in 70s comic book fashion. It's more concerned with like bombastic, shocking twists and stuff like that. You don't even know why Adele is kind of like the protagonist, for instance, in terms of like moral goodness anyway. Like, she is maybe a con woman at some points. Is she a sort of Tomb Raider-ish type of person? Things change all the time. It's keeping you guessing. Good guys are sometimes bad guys are sometimes good times. Starts out with a pterodactyl being birthed and being like terrorizing Paris, and it intersects with all these other different heists and strange things. Basically, it's just like a fun time, and I absolutely loved the artwork, and that's what it has to offer. Like, you want to see 70s Paris with the 70s cartooning or artwork, line work, that kind of stuff, with a bombastic, quintessentially French, strange storyline, basically, or you don't. And I did, and I liked it. I gave it 4 stars because I was expecting like a 3-star fine review, which is, I think, what most people gave it. Like, they were put off by the fact that you couldn't see things coming. There's all these major twists. You didn't know who the characters were really. Like, it was kind of confusing at times. But I kind of found that to be the most fun way to consume it. Like, it's part of the ride that you're signing up for. And I think some people just didn't know that they were signing up for that ride, but I did. Finally, I finished on audio and physical the Books of Jacob. So this, I'm going to pepper in some pictures of this because I know some people have the Fitz edition, and this is not Fitz, obviously, and has bigger typography. The layout is different, and it was just a really pleasant experience to consume it. I'm very glad that I didn't order the Fitz edition and just waited for this one, even though I was dying, because the flow, the pagination, the typography, all the nerdy stuff like that I'm keen for is really excellent in this. It's 992 pages, I believe. Peppered throughout, there is diagrams and historical things, and I think those are also bigger in this version, if I'm not mistaken, than the Fitz one. So everything is just easier to read, basically. It's definitely the same content, of course, though. It's also pretty heavy, so I'm gonna put it down. If you're wondering about the audiobook, there are 2 narrators, both of whom are really excellent. It alternates just between like the main perspective as well as the digressions, I guess you could say, of a very particular character narrated by the man sometimes. It's probably like 20% of the book, I'd imagine. So he doesn't pop up too much. This is such a hard book to talk about, and I've been stewing on it for a day or 2 since I finished it. Yes, it is broadly about the rise and fall of the Frankist sect of Polish Jews in a time of which Poland was very like permeable, basically, in the sense of boundaries being drawn, national identity, and all the kind of quintessential things that we think of as a nation or as a country. All of those things were kind of being made still and altered, as you see throughout this text and the life of Frank. So also it's Jacob and not Jacob, like some people have been wondering. On the audiobook, it says Jacob Frank, so for whatever that's worth. I'll show the table of contents so you kind of can see what I'm talking about, but there are numerous books within which there are essentially chapters, but the chapters are more like reframing devices. Sometimes years, months, weeks, or whatever will change. The narrators will change, the perspective will change. You're not too sure. It's all very different, and to talk about it, I kind of have to give away the fact that the narrator, the person viewing everything, the perspective, at least predominantly, is a woman who has like a supernatural aspect to her, in which she is going through a liminal state of being alive and dead, is what it said. And essentially she can have the kind of perspective that we think of as like third person omniscient. Essentially she can go in and out of people's lives. And so the quality of the narration is very interesting, because by this woman who contextualizes things in very different manner. And we also kind of know that throughout it is basically like a feminist perspective told by this woman, seeing events very differently than historians, and so becoming kind of subversive, and why it is kind of like a seminal work, basically. It is a counter narrative to what people generally talk about or don't talk about for this part of history. Apparently she made a lot of people angry at putting this out. I think this book is saying a lot about how history is constructed, how a narrative of historical accuracy is constructed, who is left out of that narrative, women, unsurprisingly, how that changes the narrative, how that changes the very specific events that the important men go through in the narrative. And then seeing at almost every level, like sometimes very granular, sometimes very macro, the flip side of humanity with all of the different things that she is discussing and looking at for people. And it's very relevant, I would say. Like, you could pick so many different topics about this book to discuss. You could talk about it in terms of modern day parasocial relationships and just how people related to the charismatic and attractiveness of Jacob himself, how he became galvanizing, how he controlled people, how sex cults in the future sort of mirrored different things that he did to control people. And then beyond the parasocial relationships, there's also sort of this like sad but inspirational narrative about Jewish community in general, I think, where people who have hurt and have been traumatized are essentially more able to be predatory, or more able to be set upon by a predator, using the ways in which they are hurt to galvanize them and drive them in ways that they are not aware of. And yet there's this kind of like almost endearing quality about the people for them to renew their faith after really hard, difficult times in which they are constantly set upon in historical means of being hurt and traumatized all over again. Their suffering is continually preyed upon and used by different versions, and it really made me think about a Philip K. Dick line about speculative fiction. It is a requirement, no, it is a condition of life that you violate your identity. And that feels very like, so again, there's like a speculative quality to this historical text, because in a way all historical stuff is just speculation anyway. But if you're able to violate your identity enough, you're able to essentially bridging the gap of an out-group into the in-group. And it's just so kind of like diabolical that Frank was able to see that and then gain a huge momentum of power in all of these people by forcing them, or at least coercing them, into violating their identity in ways that would allow him to transgress himself into the upper echelons of society. It really is like rags to riches type situation, but in the most deplorable, despicable kind of way. And it's very interesting because a lot of the narrators are from female perspectives, and a lot is asked of them in terms of violating their identity as well. Some of them do allow it to happen, some of them don't. For every single theme that is introduced, there's a flip side of it that makes you really contemplate it, I think. And so yeah, anyway, I gave this book 4.5 stars, and rounded it up to 5. I thought that, like, it's a book that I'm going to be thinking about for a very long time. It's a very challenging book. Again, it's a non-linear story. It reframes almost constantly, I would say. You have to make free associations to all the things that are happening. But I think this is largely successful at it because you are essentially just inundated with information about the past. Historical context is very big in this book. It's also very kind of like Borges-esque because I don't know how to ascertain what is real and what is not, right? Like, there are fantastical elements to this story that make it function. And so you know that it is fiction, it's classified as such, but it's like so liminal in some ways because it is so deeply researched that it's hard to tell what is real and what is not real. And I think that's to its benefit and to its detriment, because I would kind of like to know. I don't like to be super in a space where I don't know how much accuracy there is to a specific text. I hope your week has been going well for you, and comment and engage with me. I like talking about the books that I'm reading with other people. And otherwise, yeah, bye.